Welcome to Coaching with Confidence and Care podcast, inspired by common topics that arise in coach training, mentoring, and supervision. I am Dr. Luba Desamidze, the founder of Upthink Coaching. I'm an active coach trainer, mentor, and supervisor. If you are listening, you are probably looking to deepen your skills as a coach. I hope this podcast will be a helpful resource for you and contributes to your journey. Hi all! As this year is getting to a close, I actually really want to follow through on my goal of completing 20 podcast episodes. So this is episode 19, which means that I may still be able to release another one before the end of 2025. So that's my intention. Wish me luck. And I hope you succeed in whatever you're working toward by the end of the year, personally or professionally. In this episode, I want to comment on the ICF Core Coaching Competency Update from September 2025. So if you're preparing for your credential, if you're a coach who likes to keep a finger on the pulse of what's happening in the coaching industry, this episode is for you. I am fascinated every time updates come out because they're based on research, they're based on practitioner interviews, they're based on some trends and what's happening in society and the industry. We are shaping the coaching profession as we go, which shows a commitment to lifelong learning and improvement. And to start off with, I just want to give you a structural breakdown. No new competencies were added. We still have 8 core coaching competencies, which is again a great sign. It looks like our current system is complete and some competencies got more changes than others, which is also an interesting trend. And we will definitely dive deeper into details. You might have noticed that I do love to structure my episodes. I'm planning to comment on each and every competency, highlighting the changes and sharing my thinking around the implications of the changes, or comments that I personally have as a coach educator, mentor coach, or a supervisor. I hope my reflections will give you food for thought. What I have here right in front of me is the ICF Core Competencies 2019-2025 comparison chart. I'll leave the link in the comments so you can take a look at it as well. I'll go down the document and comment on the changes. Now let's jump right in. In Competency 1, demonstrates ethical practice, we experienced just a minor change related to clarification in Behavior 1.4, abides by the ICF Code of Ethics and upholds the ICF core values instead of just core values. And the core values, if you need a reminder, are professionalism, collaboration, humanity, and equity. I think it's pretty good that this competency was left stable because from a profession building perspective, ethics is treated as settled ground. The ethical statements here are very concise, to the point, and complete in terms of their coverage. We don't need to redefine ethical boundaries right now as professionals, and our strong ethical ground signals reliability for our private clients and for businesses, because it means that the ethical frame of coaching is not shifting with different trends, methodologies, or changes in society. Now moving to Core Competency 2, embodies a coaching mindset. This is the most substantially changed competency, and I have a lot to say about that. First of all, the definition of the competency itself has changed. It used to be develops and maintains a mindset that is open, curious, flexible, and client-centered. And now the definition of Competency 2 starts with engages in ongoing personal and professional learning and development as a coach, works with coaching supervisors or mentor coaches as needed, develops and maintains a mindset that is open, curious, flexible, and client-centered. The next visible change is that the number of behaviors has increased. We used to have 8, and now we have 10. Let's go through the changes in more detail. A coaching mindset is a relatively new competency, so it's okay for it to be shaping and maturing. There has been a change to Behavior 2.2, engages in ongoing learning and development as a coach, including remaining aware of current coaching best practices and use of technology. Several developments might have influenced this change. The expansion of coaching into digital, hybrid, and AI-supported context has likely triggered the inclusion of technology awareness. Although virtual coaching is the new norm, and we are all confident with delivering online sessions, and we see that our clients get impact, there has been some research on mediated communication which showed reduced access to nonverbal cues and increased projections in virtual settings. This is definitely a reminder to coaches to be mindful of possible technology influence or interference and the need to adapt their presence in technologically mediated environments. I've had very consistent hybrid engagements, meaning that in a group coaching session, some participants are in the meeting room with me and other participants are in various locations and they're all joining virtually. Keeping everyone engaged and making sure the same attention and engagement is provided to all participants is a much bigger stretch than when you do it either completely virtual or completely face-to-face. So to me, awareness of best practices and the use of technology is something where we can always keep growing and learning something new. Then the next change has been to behavior 2.4, remains aware of and open to the influence of biases, context, and culture on self and others. The word biases was not there in the previous version, and now we see increased awareness and emphasis through this official inclusion of biases in the competency model. And again, I think as many workplaces after the COVID pandemic turned to remote, hybrid, geographically dispersed mode of work, this period has intensified our awareness of systemic bias, cultural context, and power dynamics, particularly in leadership and organizational settings. So now basically everyone works with everyone in the world, and implicit bias directly affects listening and making decisions about what to share, how to share it, or where may the session go next. It may mean that good intentions are insufficient. There could be an unexamined implicit bias, and awareness of this bias is now treated as professional responsibility, which I also think is greatly beneficial to the coaching profession. I actually do have an episode on cultural awareness for coaches in case some of you are interested in cultural differences and how they may show up in coaching. I will leave the link to that episode in this episode description. The next change has been a word change in 2.6, develops and maintains the ability to manage one's emotions, whereas before it was to regulate one's emotions. A bigger change, though, has been made to behavior 2.7, maintains emotional, physical, and mental well-being in preparation for, throughout, and following each session. This is a lot more specific than what we used to have before, which was mentally and emotionally prepares for sessions. And the emphasis on well-being may reflect considerations around burnout across helping professions. Studies consistently show that emotional labor without recovery leads to reduced empathy and sometimes boundary erosion. I remember talking to a new person at one of the social events, and he asked me what I do. I told him about my job, and he said, "Wow, this is so hard. You are doing such a hard work." And I was like, yeah, it's energy consuming. Good coaching is very energy consuming if you use the self as a tool. If you are more into relational coaching, you are using your relational presence, you get attuned to the mental and emotional state of your clients, you are literally using your whole self to perceive the wholeness of the client's message, verbal and nonverbal. It's not just about facilitating a dialogue. You have to be alert at every moment in the session, and it is energy consuming. So I agree that well-being is primary. If you are not resourced, how can you create a resourceful space for others? Preparation here is not only session focused, and it doesn't mean that you review the session notes and that's it. It includes what you do for your sustainability as a coaching professional. Now, moving on to the new behavior 2.9, which says nurtures openness and curiosity in oneself, the client, and the coaching process. So this new behavior, 2.9, positions the coach as someone who continuously monitors how they're shaping the coaching space, not just what the client is doing in it. I think many of us would agree that this is what we've been doing anyway. Even before it was here, we knew that a coaching mindset is about being open-minded and shifting from judgment to curiosity. Formalizing this and including this into competencies is a great reminder that this is really one of the key traits of a coaching mindset. It's also the evidence of the fact that core coaching competencies emerge from best practices. You know, when I teach or mentor coaches, I often have to bust this myth that competencies need to be memorized as if they were something artificially created and imposed. This is not completely how I see this. I see competencies as emerged from best practices. And now you can recognize that some of the behaviors that you already do that haven't been in the competencies now have become part of this. So I think that's a great trend. Last but not least, there's a very interesting behavior edit, 2.10, which says, remains aware of the influence of one's thoughts and behaviors on the client and others. How do you like that? Let's pause and see where these may be going. First, there's an explicit inclusion of supervision and mentor coaching in the Competency 2 definition, which signals that reflective practice is a new requirement, not an option. Then there's this awareness of the influence of thoughts and behaviors on the client and others, which also requires a certain degree of developmental maturity, recognizing one's limitations and actively working with them. So a coach is not only client-centered, although this of course remains, it's not going anywhere, but there's a requirement now that a coach is self-aware enough to avoid contaminating the client's thinking with their unconscious assumptions, projections, their own past stories, or emotional experiences. As a coach and supervisor, I think these are extremely valuable additions to the competency because of processes such as transference, countertransfers, projections, etc. ICF avoids clinical terminology, and I think they do deliberately, which is fair, but the behaviors described in Competency 2 map directly onto the management of relational dynamics that may arise unconsciously, especially when two humans engage in a meaningful dialogue involving vulnerability. For example, countertransference refers to the coach's emotional reactions to the client that are shaped by the coach's own history, values, identity, preferred narratives, or unresolved material. It is good that ICF deliberately avoids psychodynamic language to keep coaching distinct from therapy and to focus competencies on observable behaviors and professional responsibilities, but not naming these processes doesn't mean that they're not present. Coaches are responsible for managing their inner experience without interrupting the client's inner world, and these processes are often invisible when working alone. Supervision is an invitation not to reflect alone, and it is difficult for practitioners without regular reflective spaces to be accurate in self-assessing their impact. Wrapping up here, the changes to Competency 2 show requirements for coaches to increase their professional maturity, which I think adds a lot of value to clients and to practitioners themselves. I also see this as a more pronounced image of a coach, in a way. And the image that emerges for me personally from this revised version of Competency 2 is that of a reflective, self-regulating professional whose primary instrument is themselves. A coach is no longer defined mainly by conversational skills or neutrality or techniques, but it is someone who engages in ongoing professional development, who's aware of their impact, and who's accountable to professional standards beyond the coaching session. Additionally, the coach is positioned as an active participant in the client's learning system, as an active ingredient and a catalyst in this learning space. Well, let's move to competency 3. Establishes and maintains agreements. There are no changes in the definition here, but there's one new behavior added and a few language clarifications. Under 3.1, we now have describes one's coaching philosophy and clearly defines what coaching is not for potential clients and stakeholders. The word philosophy is new here, and I really love how much more specific the language of the revised competencies has become. Observable and measurable behaviors make it easier for everyone, and I've personally noticed that when the competencies are translated in other languages, the meaning may be partially lost. So quite a helpful change here. Another change is to 3.2, and it's about reaching agreement about several items, including commitment to working toward coaching goals. This reinforces the definition of coaching as a partnership and clarifies that it's not just the coach who's pulling the weight, while the client just sits back and waits for the coach to wave a magic wand and create transformation in their life. It doesn't work like that. It's a high-quality partnership that brings results, and commitment to working towards coaching goals is part of that. Under 3.11, the added specificity is partners with a client to close the coaching relationship in a way that respects the client and the coaching experience, which is beautifully said. Closure is an important part of any process or relationship, and increased emphasis on it is an invitation to revisit your own closure process with clients, and I trust that most of us have been doing that anyway. The final change here is a new behavior, 3.12, which says, revisits the coaching agreement when necessary to ensure the coaching approach is meeting the client's needs, which again, I think most of us have been doing anyway, and now this formal addition simply makes it an official reminder and reinforces the fact that coaching agreements are dynamic, not static. It is the coach's responsibility to notice when the agreement no longer fits the client's reality and to initiate renegotiation. Because the client may not even know that renegotiation is possible, or may not know how to start the conversation about it, or may perceive the agreement as much more rigid than it actually is. So it's on us to initiate and to stay sensitive to the dynamics of the coaching agreement and engagement. Now, curiously enough, there have been no changes to core competency 4, cultivates trust and safety. It looks like all the behaviors are complete for now. The wording and scope of this competency were preserved without any expansion or reduction, which may signal that trust and safety are already well defined in the ICF framework and that further specification is not needed. Trust is emergent, not procedural, is not a formality. And I actually love that no new behaviors were added and that there's no kind of encouragement of additional superficial trust-building behaviors. They may not even translate across cultures, relationships, or organizational context. Next is core competency 5, maintains presence, which remained unchanged in its definition, but there's one new behavior added, which is very curious, and it says, remains aware of what's emergent for self and client in the present moment. And I wonder if you noticed how often the revised competencies now turn back to the coach's processes, coach's self-awareness, and professional development. I find this quite interesting because in the past, the belief was that a coach stays away from the client's process and remains more distant, doesn't share anything about themselves, does not bring anything from them. And there are still coaches who believe that a coach must not bring anything coming from themselves into sessions because what's theirs is theirs. And what is the client's is the client's. And coaches must only focus on the material that their client is bringing. Well, my view on this is different, and I know I'm definitely not alone in this. Whatever emerges in the coach may not necessarily be the coach's own material, as long as the coach is self-aware, attuned to the client, present, using themselves as a tool, relationally connected, uses emotional, somatic, and energetic signals, working with the field, undergoing supervision. It may be the client's material that is being captured and creating resonance for the coach. Of course, a common question that is, how do I differentiate between something that is my own material and something that is not my own material? And well, definitely reflect on this. I also like how the new behavior focuses on emergence, which again reinforces the dynamic nature of coaching and invites practitioners to stay alert to shifts in energy, meaning, direction, or understanding that arise during the conversation. In a way, this change touches on advanced coaching capacity without naming specific modalities. Maybe they will do that in one of the next rounds of revisions, naming or including somatic, coaching, intuition, or complexity theories. High-level coaching is not linear, and insight often arises from what is not planned. Enhanced presence includes the ability to notice that and work with that. And what's important is that when we talk about emergence, we are not talking about anything mystical or therapeutic. It is still grounded in awareness without interpretation. You notice what's emergent, but you do not impose meaning. You do not interpret, and this helps you preserve the coaching stance. So if your perception has been that the main task is to steer the session, it's not always about actively steering, but also about being able to stay with the moment, which may be equally valuable and can also be an opportunity to move the session forward just by slowing down. For the client, this may create more meaningful experiences because the conversation will follow relevance and the client doesn't feel dragged towards an agenda or feel like they're being offered a tool or exercise and they have to go through that. The conversation follows energy, relevance, and responsiveness. Now to Competency 6, listens actively. There haven't been any big changes, just slight language clarifications. In 6.2 and 6.5, instead of using the word communicated, what the client communicated, or what's being communicated, it now says what the client is communicating, or the meaning of what the client is communicating. I think active listening is already very detailed. It already includes verbal content, non-verbal content, emotional tone, values, context, what is unsaid. There's really little to add. Because remember, we are not turning listening into analysis. We are still focused on listening. It's not really about accumulating new listening techniques, but about continuing to do good work. Competency 7 includes one of the most controversial changes in the whole set of competencies. There's only one change, but it's quite a big one. Competency 7 evokes awareness, has now a change to behavior 7.11, which says shares observations, knowledge, and feelings without attachment that have the potential to create new insights for the client. In the previous version, we did not have the word knowledge, and it said create new learning for the client. Now it says create new insights. I wonder how you feel about this. Many of us have differentiated coaching for a very long time by saying that coaching is not about teaching, not about knowledge, not about being an expert, not about transferring knowledge to the client. And now we have the word knowledge explicitly included in the competencies. So how does that work? What does that mean? I invite you not to just focus on specific nouns here, but on the whole sentence. It still says shares without attachment. Additionally, it says that all the sharings need to have the potential to create new insights for the client. This means that even though there's now explicit acceptance of offering informal of offering informational contributions. You don't simply start teaching or lecturing. In situations where it may bring value to offer carefully considered input as part of evoking client insight, and as long as you offer it without attachment and remain client-centered, this may be appropriate. The competency is called evokes awareness. So even when you offer knowledge, you offer it as a coaching tool to evoke awareness. Coaching here is learning to balance non-directive practice with occasional, situationally appropriate use of expertise while protecting client agency, because it's still the client who decides whether or not to use it. Maybe an example from my own practice will help here. A few years ago, I had a client who believed she was a terrible team leader, and that belief stopped her from pursuing leadership roles further because she had a bad experience with leading a team in the past. And she said, "I realize that I'm a terrible team leader." I asked her to elaborate on what she meant. And when she gave me an example from her actual working context, it was clear to me, because I'm a team coach as well, that those people were not a team. They were a group of people without any interrelations or interconnections. They did not have a shared goal. There was no reason for them to be a team. And my client blamed herself for not being a good team leader for a group that wasn't a team in the first place. And she was creating this inner barrier to herself. And I asked her if it were okay, I shared a definition of a team for her to reflect on. And when I shared the definition, just a sentence mentioning a shared goal, interdependence, interrelations, she found that insightful and liberating. It allowed her to redefine her role with that group, her behaviors with that group, and to understand why some of the processes unfolded the way they did, so she could change her behaviors moving forward. Now, what's most important here is that although there's permission to do this, and it may be more appropriate in certain types of coaching, such as organizational coaching, this input must be carefully timed and carefully selected. Knowledge may function like a well-placed question or analogy that catalyzes insight or integration. At the same time, I invite you to be careful, because research on bias and power dynamics shows that such inputs can become directive or normative, especially if a coach is unaware of their influence. That is why the competency insists on sharing without attachment, because there's a risk of imposing the coach's frame, which we want to avoid. So this is another reason why supervision becomes so crucial. Without it, there's always a risk to unconsciously steer sessions towards a coach's own framework, which may appear as helpful knowledge, but actually narrow the client's exploration. So be ready to withdraw your input. And with your supervisor, it may be a helpful question to explore how you differentiate between a useful intervention from an urge to give advice or your own projection. This change is also very relevant to me as a coach and educator, because it signals the need to revisit training materials, which we have already started doing, to ensure that we now teach not only what to do in a different way, but how to do it. Last but not least, Competency 8 facilitates client growth. There's a small change in wording and a new behavior. The new 8.8 now says acknowledges the client's progress and successes, and it used to be celebrates the client's progress and successes. And the new behavior 8.7 says partners with the client to integrate learning and sustain progress throughout the coaching engagement. Again, this is one of those changes that most of us have already been doing, and now it's been formalized. There's still a strong focus on client autonomy, but also more emphasis on long-term impact and integration over time, not just momentum. It is less transactional, It's not just about outcome control within a single session or making some action points. Coaches are expected to help clients notice patterns, embed learning, and adapt actions beyond finishing a session with an action plan. And again, I think most of us have been doing this anyway, so I think we will take this change very naturally. Now that's it. That's what I wanted to share about the revised competencies. Overall, I think they definitely move our profession toward greater clarity of language, which is important in a global environment, and toward more specific behaviors and expectations. They also reflect more impact, more awareness, and greater maturity of the coach, more awareness of inner processes and how they contribute to the coaching process. They acknowledge that a coach is not simply a driver of a process, not a toolbox, not someone who rigidly follows a conversation structure and asks some formalized questions, but someone who's attuned, flexible, relational, self-aware, and continuously developing their own capacity. I think these are all very good changes. If this episode was useful, feel free to send it to someone you're in conversation with anyway, a colleague, a peer, another coach who's also trying to make sense of these changes. That's usually how this podcast travels. If you're listening and thinking that you'll benefit from training focused on deeper emotional, relational, and intercultural processes, then yes, I do run PCC level training that goes deeper into this side of the work. The next level 2 program opens in spring 2026. Everything is on the website if and when you want to look. upthinkcoaching.com. You can also just find me on LinkedIn and say hello. I'm always open to thoughtful professional conversations, and I work one-to-one through mentor coaching and supervision for coaches who want a reflective space. Next time, I'll choose a topic to close out the year. I'm letting the ideas sit and take shape, and I'm comfortable with not knowing just yet. Join me for one more episode before the end of 2025. Thanks for listening.